Happy Easter, everybody. How are we doing? It's great to see you. So glad that you're here. Thanks for choosing to celebrate with us. For those of you tuning in online, we're glad that you're here as well. And wow, what an incredible day and just what an incredible kickoff already. I'm so glad that you were here on behalf of over 60 servant leaders in our team. I'm just so glad to welcome you to Easter at Restoration Church. It's one of my favorite days of the year. And perhaps you come to church all the time. Perhaps you're here for the first time. But wherever you find yourself, I just want to say, you look beautiful. We have our Easter glow up on, and again, right, you polish up real nice. But this time of year, it's one of those things where we love to dress up. We love to see nature show off, right? Spring just shows up, and beauty just seems to come to life yet again. For those of you that grew up here in Southern California, we see it. We go to the Carlsbad flower fields. We can kind of get a sense of it, a great sunset. But we get that all year long. And if you've ever lived anywhere else, in the Midwest specifically, where everything dies for like 6 months and then it actually comes back to life, not early enough for this Easter, I've been told, from my friends still back in Chicago. But you just see it. There's something about the beauty of nature and the beauty of life, the beauty of people, the beauty of relationships that just captivates us. And, it's one of those things that this time of year, springtime, Easter time, it's just a reminder of the reality that new beginnings are always waiting. That there's always the beauty of a new beginning at even the darkest point in your life or the darkest point in nature. There's always that potential. And it can draw you in if you actually let it capture your attention. That beauty has the power to draw us in, to capture our attention, to woo us and charm us towards a part of life that perhaps we wouldn't go otherwise if it were just for utility, right? I mean, y'all polish up real nice. This beauty all around us. This building looks incredible, right? There's a unicorn in the parking lot. Again, like beauty is all around. But it's one of those things, what does beauty actually add to the world anyway? I don't know if you've ever thought about that. But the amount of money we spend to make things beautiful, to make our homes beautiful, our yards beautiful, ourselves beautiful, our portfolios beautiful, whatever it is, we spend all this time and energy to create positive, beautiful things in the world, whether you're artistic or not. But if you ever stop to wonder, like, what value does it even add to the world? How can you objectively quantify beauty? Anyways, in his profound book, When Everything is on Fire, Brian Zahan writes this incredible chapter. I'm going to read you just a section of it that just captured my heart about a year ago. Coming out of pandemic and trying to figure out how do we continue to follow Jesus in this new world. And he writes his thoughts on why beauty matters specifically when it comes to the story of Jesus. He says this, because it's been said that no one's ever really become a Christian because they lost an argument. And I suspect that's true. Maybe you've had that experience where someone tried that on you and it didn't work. He writes, I also suspect, though, that far more people than we imagine have begun to follow Jesus for the simple reason that they were charmed by the beauty of the Christ. I would much rather, he says, ground my faith on the beauty of Christ than biblical lyricism. Biblical lyricism can be debunked by a college freshman, but the beauty of Christ can withstand even the most formidable attack one like Nietzsche could muster. See, if I'm hedging my bets, he writes, on the survival of this faith in Jesus as we hurtle into an age of deconstructionism, it is because the King of our hearts is still so beautiful. And I'm willing, Brian writes, to bet my grandchildren's faith on the beauty of Christ. And I don't know how that quote strikes you today. I don't know where you find yourself in your own life, but I think it's interesting, especially on an Easter weekend, to consider all of the art and the iconography and the tattoos and the jewelry that we wear that's beautiful, that is the shape of a cross. Maybe you have one on right now. That there's this thing about this story where what was designed for the greatest pain and suffering and disgrace and tragedy actually now becomes a thing that we mark as beautiful. Like, we never went around intending to wear jewelry made out of an instrument of death, and yet 2,000 years later, we see it all the time. That Jesus reversed what was designed to curse him to be something beautiful for us. And so why does that matter? Why does Easter matter? Why does beauty matter? Why does the beauty of Jesus at Easter specifically matter for you today? Well, I think the reason is because most of us have asked that kind of question before. Not necessarily about beauty or Easter or why I wear an execution device around my neck, cladded in gold, but more specifically, why does any of this matter anyways? And more personally, do I matter anyways? Why does any of this matter, this world we live in, the life we live? Does any of it matter after all? And then late at night, when you can't fall asleep, you wonder, do I matter to anyone at all? And perhaps you find yourself at church today or tuning in online, and you've been taught or come to believe that across your life and your experience that when it comes to the Easter story or to the story of God at all or any of this kind of religious stuff, that you have to put your brain and maybe even your pain in a jar on a shelf and keep it far away because God can't really handle that. And yet, this is why Easter matters. That no matter where you find yourself today, this morning, or wherever you're watching online, that your pain, your story, your real human experience is the exact reason why Easter is important and why Easter is for you. See, God didn't settle himself by being distant from our pain. That he doesn't allow the story of tragedy that is woven throughout the human experience to be the only narrative that's allowed to speak. See, God was not okay simply standing by and watching all of us create a world for ourselves that became increasingly devoid of beauty and full of other things like war on the headlines and loss in your life, anxiety and loneliness and depression are all on the rise. Manipulation by the powerful of those under-resourced and overlooked runs rampant, even in spaces like churches. And God was not content to say, well, let's let him lie. But instead, he decided to show up himself, to enter into the human story, that song we sang of Jesus showing up as God in human form to say, there's a better storyline for you. Because without it, all we're really left to is to try our best, to fake our way through it, to turn off the news channel, or to drink enough to pretend like nothing's really all that wrong. And that's not the life that you were designed for. And deep down, we know that. See, God doesn't pull everything away that we've been through. He doesn't leave the sin or self-destruction that we've caused off to the side and said, just forget about it. He's not willing to leave that story alone, but actually was willing to enter into that very storyline with you and interweave into the story of tragedy of the human experience the thread of beauty to meet you right where you are. That this is the gospel, that this is the Easter story, that there is a glorious strand of hope and love and purpose and life that coalesced and crashed together at the cross. That the greatest tragedy ever, where the worst thing happened to the best person, the thing that was designed to torture and abuse and beat Jesus was actually the moment where God demonstrated his power, his promise, and his love for you. See, Easter is not just an opportunity to eat ham and dress up in pastels or neon colors here today, I guess, right? But Easter is actually the celebration of the intersection of tragedy and beauty, the most human things that God ever stepped into. See, this is the story, not just of our individual lives, but of the human story, that there is tragedy and beauty all around us simultaneously. And what we decide to make of those and how we put those together in our own life not only says a lot about us, but will determine a lot about how we view the world and view others and certainly view a moment like Easter. And this is why it matters. This is why it matters for you. That whatever you're carrying, whatever you're facing, whatever you can't seem to figure out, but you're holding it anyways, Jesus says, I know what that's like. I've been there and I care about that. See, there was a guy named John who was one of Jesus' best friends, and I think he grew up an emo kid before it was cool because he's just the ultimate poetic right? And in his account of Jesus' life, while he walks through certain important historical events, he always finds a way to weave poetry into history. And he writes in his account of Jesus' life in John 13 about the last night that he would spend with Jesus before he saw him be falsely accused and arrested, beaten within an inch of his life, and ultimately nailed to a cross to breathe his last breath. And he writes this about a small room that they had gathered in, just a few of his friends. And it says, but Passover celebration was there. And so before the Passover celebration time came, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and return to the Father. That he loved his disciples, his followers, during his ministry on earth. And now he loved them to the very end. I think it's interesting that John wasn't just writing what he was seeing happen live right in front of him, but he was writing later not just about what had happened, but what he knew. What he maybe didn't know at the time, but what he knows now. And there's a difference between what we can see and what we know, right? There's a difference, and John illuminates that. And to be honest, when it comes to Easter, John needed that historical advantage in order to write something like that. And the gift that you and I have is that gift of that historical advantage, knowing that Easter is coming. But for them that evening, it was not a great day. They did not have the privilege that we have to look back on. For the first century followers of Jesus, I don't know if anybody ever told you this, but when Jesus was killed, there were no more Christians. There were no believers, there were no followers. There was not a celebration, there was a funeral. There was a broken-hearted mother, some scattered friends and followers, a few Galilean fishermen who were distraught and disappointed that they had wasted their life for the last 3 years following this carpenter from Galilee. How could they be so gullible? They had wasted not only their life and their time, but they had wasted their faith on Jesus. They thought he was who he said he was. They thought that he was the promised Messiah. They thought that maybe, just maybe, he was the Son of God here to rescue them and to set them free. And maybe, just maybe, love and the beauty he brought to the world, and even those that religion and power had overlooked, even just maybe that love could make a difference. So they thought. But then on Friday, that was clearly not the case. All that they had built toward had come crashing down, because with Jesus buried in a tomb, there was no need to keep the movement going. That it went well for 3 years and it was a good run, but now Jesus had become the victim of corrupt temple and oppressive empire, and he was gone. And for them, the first Easter wasn't the celebration that we expect. For the first followers of Jesus, Easter was when the worst thing happened to the best person. The worst thing imaginable happened to the best person they ever knew. And they couldn't make sense of it. And I imagine that perhaps for many of you here today, there's spaces in your life where you can't imagine how to make sense of something that you're facing. A diagnosis or a financial reality, a relationship that's on the rocks, or just the state of our world. And how am I supposed to have Easter when there's war in the birthplace of Christ? When there's people suffering and oppression looming, and that there's nothing I can seem to do to make my own life move forward, much less the state of humanity. God, where are you? And if that's where you find yourself this morning, I want you to know that's actually a better understanding of Easter than you may realize. Because Easter, that first Easter, was when the worst thing happened to the very best person. You don't have to take my word for it, that hanging on the cross, Jesus was there. He had been beaten within an inch of his life. He was bloodied and disfigured. And yet his followers write that he did something so unexpected in that moment that they couldn't even believe it. That as he's hanging there, struggling for breath to sustain his shallowing life, he chooses to use the energy that he barely has left to say something that no one would forget. That he says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. That in the moment of his deepest pain and shame, the thing that Jesus offers the world was love and forgiveness. Maybe there is hope for beauty after all. But then Darkness moves in, covers the earth. According to them, it's so dark they can't even see, kind of like a dark, rainy Easter morning. And Jesus shouts out as loud as he possibly can, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which is Aramaic for my God, why have you given up on me? The most human of prayers uttered by the Son of God. And then he says, it is finished. I have completed what I was sent here to do, but it cost him his life. And there were people around the cross, those that were hoping that this would somehow turn at the last minute and be, just kidding, storybook ending. And then there were those whose job was there to actually make sure that this was the end of this apocalyptic rabbi from Galilee. And the Roman soldiers watching Jesus breathe his last, Matthew records that there was a Roman officer standing there facing him, watching Jesus die. That was his job for the day, was to ensure that this alleged criminal met his justice. And when he saw how Jesus died, he exclaimed, this man truly must be the Son of God. The most unlikely believer in this story is the first to declare what heaven was waiting for us to know. That when darkness had fallen, his friends had abandoned him, death was eagerly crouching at the door, ready to celebrate victory. Heaven was simply counting to 3. And for you and for me, there is this moment where Jesus is dead, laying in the darkness of a tomb that your life represents perhaps right now. That there's a space in your story that feels hopeless, feels dead, feels utterly devoid of beauty and full to the brim of tragedy and misunderstanding. And you can't imagine why God or where God must be for this to exist if he is real. And I understand. If I was walking through what you're facing, I'm sure I would feel the same way that you must. And Jesus understood, and his followers understood, because they faced that same thing. And then yet 3 days later, from deep within a tunnel in the earth, the heart of a dead man began to beat again. Something that is anything short of impossible to explain actually happens. That the one who breathed the cosmos into being begins to breathe himself. The corpse of the Creator that laid in the suffocation of death traded that for lungs full of grace and life. The burden of the law was switched out and replaced with a scandal of grace for you. The constricting grave clothes of religion was gone, and life-giving personal relationship with a freedom-giving God was available for you and for me. This open and welcoming, eternal and restored reality made possible through resurrection was better than they could have ever imagined, and yet it wasn't what they expected at all. So whether you're a sinner or a saint this morning, whether you would consider yourself a church person or not, whether you're a single mother or an unwanted daughter, whether you are a forgotten brother or this is the first Easter you find yourself without your father, whether you're black, white, Asian, Latinx, wherever you find yourself on the spiritual spectrum, whether you feel broken or whole, weak or strong, or if you are honest, would say, I don't know if I belong here. Easter is reaching for you and for me, reminding you that love is alive, that hope is real, and that freedom is here. That this is what the gospel actually is, that you are actually invited to step into this new resurrection life. The resurrection wasn't just for Jesus, it was actually for you too. That's the best news of all. That's actually why Easter matters. It's not because it happened, but because every day you are invited to see it happening in your own story. From every person, from that Roman official to the women who found Jesus' tomb empty, to their surprise, they were going to embalm his body because it was rushed. And, if you want something done right, send a woman, right? So they were going to fix what the men couldn't do themselves, right? From the Roman officers to those first women who were invited to share the gospel with the world, the reason we know the good news of resurrection, everyone who has ever been impacted by this news, whoever has accepted that opportunity is available for them has been impacted and transformed and restored by it. But it is an interwoven invitation. And the reality is that you are invited to accept it. You are invited to accept the interwoven invitation of God's love for you, that beauty is mixed into your greatest sense of tragedy, that not only for your own life, but for the world, there is hope and there is life, because love is alive, because Jesus is alive. And yet there's the choice we have to make, right? We wonder if we are accepted. And I want you to know that the story and the character of God shows that for him to offer the invitation to you says he's already accepted you. He's placed the envelope at your door, that you are not only accepted, you are invited. But the question is, will you accept that invitation? There was a man named Saul who was making it his mission to crush this little upstart Jesus movement that was happening in his hometown. And yet later, when he meets Jesus as the most unlikely suspect, he finds that not only did this murdered rabbi from Galilee come back to life, but that he didn't come back to get him back, he came back to get him for himself. That Jesus didn't come back to life to get Saul back, but to get Saul for his own purposes and ultimately save Saul's life. And Saul became the Apostle Paul and moved all around the Mediterranean rim, telling people about how Jesus had changed his life. He starts churches in all these different cities, one in the incredible city of Corinth that you can still visit to this day, where he begins this little ecclesia, this little gathering of people that said, you know what? The story of Jesus is a better story. I want to step into that journey. And as best I know how, I want to follow not just a good teacher, because those are a dime a dozen, but a resurrected rabbi. And he writes to them and he says, ultimately, there's all these things that we're going to see in the world. There's all the things we're going to see that are challenges and the things that are going to be difficult, but there are going to be three things, only three things that are going to last forever. And he says faith, hope, and love. And then he says, and the greatest of these, the most important of those is love. But see, on the surface, if we're honest, we would rather faith and hope outlast love, wouldn't we? Like, I want my faith to survive, so I want everything to work out the way I expect so that my faith feels strong. See, I want things to go and continually get obviously better so that hope makes sense. That's what I want, if I'm honest, in my life. I want my circumstances to demonstrate that faith and hope are worth it. Love, sometimes it doesn't feel like it adds a whole lot. How do you quantify the value and the beauty of love? But Paul says actually what you need most and what lasts the longest, what is the greatest, is love. Easter is a celebration of the intersection of beauty and tragedy because the greatest of these is love. Because the greatest need you have and the greatest thing God has to offer you is the love of Jesus in your life. That when your faith runs out, you are loved. That when tragedy strikes and your hope runs dry, you're loved. That when the self-destruction of your life and the choices that you've made raises shame to an all-time high, you are still loved by God, even if you can't muster that love for yourself. That when all feels lost, like it did for those first followers of Jesus that first Easter, love is alive. When hate is all you hear and fear is all you know how to feel, love is on the rise. Love is available for you, even when you want to give up on yourself, when you want to give up on your marriage, when you want to give up on your kids, when you want to give up on that job, when you want to give up on God. His love lasts forever. That even death could not hold him down. See, this is what's incredible and it's so important, right? Following Jesus doesn't give you a path around suffering. Sometimes it leads you right through it because that's where Jesus went. That's where he was willing to go. His love for you was so powerful and so consistent, so dependable that he gave up his life. not to change the story, but to rewrite it entirely from the inside out, to step into our human story, not evacuate from it, to step into our story so that we would see that his life, his death, and his resurrection is God's exclamation point on the fact that the greatest of these is love, and it's available for you. And so I don't know what this proves. I don't know if that matters to you, but to me, the fact that God can even use my brokenness as artistic material to build something beautiful, it's pretty compelling. It seems to continue to draw my attention of my soul. That God isn't here to change me, but to actually empower me and empower you to become something brand new, to create a beautiful story, even written through your most tragic moments, and also to use your story to make a more beautiful world. That Jesus ultimately dies to love you and I to life. That is the message of Easter. That Jesus died to love you to life. So yeah, I think Easter matters. I think this story matters, not just on this specific Sunday in spring, but every minute of every day of your life, it matters. Not just as a religious belief system, but as a transforming invitation. Easter matters. And so I don't know where that finds you this morning, but we would be remiss if we didn't give you a chance to actually receive the invitation of God's love if you never have before. And so in just a moment, I want to invite you to pray, and you don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to have all your questions answered. But if you would say this morning, I am captivated by the beauty of Jesus, then that's more than enough. Because the incredible thing about God is that when you give God your life, Jesus gives you his. That when you give God your life, Jesus, without hesitation, gives you his, meets you where you're at, comes alongside you and empowers you moving forward, that you don't have to face those questions alone any longer. So in just a moment, we're going to pray, and I would invite you to join us. We pray around here with our hands held open. We just think it demonstrates with our bodies what we hope our heart and soul's posture is, that God, I'm open to what it is that you want to do. If it is true that your love is the greatest and it's available to me, then I want to be open-handed to that. So I'll just invite you to hold out your hands if you feel comfortable. That might be the greatest posture of prayer you may ever take in your life. And I just want to pray for you, pray with you, that we might experience the beauty of the love of God made available to you through Easter. Let's pray. God, thank you so much that even in the midst of what felt like the greatest tragedy, the story of beauty was just beginning. And that it is available to us here and now in the midst of our brokenness, that beauty can be born again. If you've never given your life to Jesus, if you've been taught you had to believe the right things or get all your questions answered in order to come to God or to clean up your life and get beautiful on your own, I hope that you know that all you have to do is say yes. That there's perhaps a long conversation you and God can have, but to begin it, all you have to say is, Jesus, my life is yours. Jesus, my life is yours. And when you do that, he promises to empower you to love and follow him, and that you will begin to see the beauty interwoven in the tragedy. He won't fix everything, but that you will be made new. That Easter will come alive in your life. So if that's where you're at this morning, I would just invite you to say those words in the quietness of your own heart. Jesus, I give you my life. Jesus, this Easter, I give you my life. And if you prayed that, we want to celebrate with you. If you would just raise your hand, we just want to see you so we can meet you and connect with you. We want to help you take your next steps in what God is doing in your story. If that's you, would you just raise your hand? I see you. Anyone else? Back there. Back there, I see you. God, thank you. Thank you that there is something compelling about the story of beauty that changes our life, even though it cost you yours. Jesus, thank you that resurrection is real and that love is alive. It's in your name we pray. Amen and amen. Well, the scriptures say that when one person decides to embrace this life-giving relationship with Jesus, that all of heaven celebrates. I would say let's join them for just a second, right? For those of you that raise your hand, congratulations. We celebrate you. Happy Easter. If you prayed that simple prayer, I would invite you to grab your phone and simply text the phrase forever free to the number 94000. Forever free to 94000. We would love to celebrate you, partner with you, and come alongside you and empower you to love and follow this Jesus who loves you so much. Can we celebrate with people that made that decision?